Welcome to Social Suite's webinar. My name is Brad Gurry. I'm the CEO of Social Suite, and I'm going to be your host for the webinar this afternoon. We've had an overwhelming response to today's webinar, so I'd really like to thank everyone for their attendance to start with. As we wait for some people to join the webinar today, we're just going to run a short poll. So you'll see that come up in your on the right-hand side of your screen. So let me just share that with you now. And essentially what we're asking is where you're at in your ESG journey. So if you can go ahead and fill that in, that'd be fantastic. And we'll get to see a bit of a sense on where organizations are in their ESG journey. So today's webinar is aligning ESG with your annual reporting. Now, this is a really timely webinar as we approach the end of the financial year and organizations start to turn their attention to preparing their annual reports. So now's just the perfect time to be considering what ESG disclosures that your organization is looking at making. So today we've got two fantastic panelists to take us through and explore this as a topic. We've got Dr. Sandy Chong, and also Dr. Tim Seigenbecken. And it's great to have Sandy on the webinar today. Sandy has an extensive background as a board member on both listed and non-listed organisations. Sandy is the chair of the Sustainability Development Goals for the United Nations Association of Western Australia. And alongside that, Sandy is also a non-executive director and ESG chair of ASX-listed FYI Resources. Alongside Sandy is Tim. Tim is the Chief Impact Officer of Social Suite. Tim's got a wealth of experience around ESG, having helped some 100+ listed organisations around the world with their ESG journey. Before we kick off, just a couple of points around Social Suite. Social Suite is an ESG software provider. We're helping around 200 organisations around reporting. 100 of those organisations are listed entities, mostly on the ASX, and we're typically helping micro to mid-cap companies get started with their ESG journey in an affordable, practical way. So before I hand over to Tim and Sandy, today is an interactive session. If you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar today, please put them in the chat section of the website. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's session. I'll hand over to Tim and Sandy.
Excellent. Thanks, Brett, for that introduction. And Sandy, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today. I'll quickly outline what the agenda is for today, and then we'll just jump straight into. So what we're going to look at today is really around the reporting season. And we've broken it up in two components because there's quite a significant role in that as well, generally speaking, around ESG for the board, but also in that reporting season. So we'll start off today with a short kind of overview of what the board's ESG mandate is. And we'll talk a little bit with Sandy about that today from her unique board perspective around that as a director on an ASX-listed company's board. We'll jump in after that into really kind of the core session around what can you do in the reporting season, thinking about where does that integration between ESG and annual reporting sit? Are there any minimum disclosures I need to think about? Do I have still time to do something if I haven't done anything yet for this reporting season? And we'll end up really quickly with what are the first steps to get started with ESG? Then if there are any questions, we'll hand over to Brad and do a Q&A to see what the questions are. So first off, on the board's ESG mandate, I really want to, like I said, really thank Sandy for joining us today. She's a non-executive director for FYI Resources. And what I've done here is just put a little bit of information from FYI's website around their effort on ESG reporting and sustainability. And I think it really is something that I want to highlight is that there's a lot of information. They take ESG very seriously, as you can see here. They do a lot of reporting with our platform. They do quarterly updates, they do their annual reports, but they also are being rated by Sustainalytics. So they really look at trying to get a rating, trying to understand where they can do better, close the gaps, improve some of the work they're doing from an ESG perspective. So there's a lot happening there. Now, I think you can only get to that point if you really drive that from the top. So Sandy, you joined FYI Resource, I believe, last year in the board, but specifically with a ESG focus. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What are you bringing to the board, and why is it so important to have that strong focus in the board level around ESG?
So they interviewed me and they wanted to engage me actually more than a year ago. So in 2021, I think all kudos to the CEO. He had this foresight and he can see how the wave is coming with regards to the demand for better governance and more transparency in the reporting, particularly because we're a mining company. So there are lots of concerns with environmental, social, and also the way we actually have systems and processes to measure those first two. So we had a chat, and basically right from the get-go, I told him I only want to do this if the company is determined to take this seriously, and if they really want to commit in making an impact, measuring the impact, and obviously improve them. Obviously, you can't go from 0 to 1 immediately, but you got to start somewhere. And so my job was really to help identify all these gaps when I first got into the company, and find out how are they doing when it comes to reporting, and how are they doing when it comes to communicating it, because I think communication is also a big piece. Currently, a lot of companies are asking themselves, why should I do this if there's no legislation for me to do this? Or why should I do this because my competitors are not doing it? This is an additional cost for me. So there's a lot of inertia. And then also for those who are doing it, they're wondering, what should I report on? How should I communicate? Damn if I do, damn if I don't. Particularly with these awareness now of people wanting to know whether you have been greenwashing in your report, and how are you doing this, and how are you measuring it. So it is extremely important to go down this path. And I think as board members, we need to ask ourselves, questions like, are we effectively creating an environment where people are going to be treated fairly, and they're going to be treated properly at all levels? Yeah? Is it too broad, and how do we better define this? What are the priorities? What are the gaps? You can't do everything. Even if you're using a framework like the UN SDG goals, there are 17 goals there. You can't achieve this yesterday. So I think, have a look at what you're already doing. You probably surprise yourself. You probably already have done things over the last couple of years that would meet these targets, that have already addressed these concerns, either by your employees, your shareholders, or even your customers. So think about that, and then also ask ourselves, are we doing what we need to do to really prevent one of those nasty situations or surprises? And how are we actually going to train the executives, and more importantly, the management, right, to actually deploy this and to actually implement this? And more importantly, how do you own them, right? There's not a lot of experience in this space, and I think it's very natural that when people don't have any kind of experience in anything, they don't want to take it on. But it's like a ticking time bomb. It's happening. It's going to happen. And so I think companies should just take it, bite-sized. And that's exactly what happened with FYI. We started off by looking at assessing some sentiments, and also do a stakeholders survey, a 360 degrees assessment to find out what are the key institutional investors, what are the key shareholders think of the ESG, and what is most concerning of them. So that's really important to just get a feel of what is the sentiment in the market. And then from there, you consult the board. And that's where all the revealing sentiments come out, right? Some board members are very keen on adopting it, and some board members are just sitting on the fence and wondering how this is going to cost us. And obviously, you're going to have 1 or 2 board members who are quite resistant to it. So it's just a matter of education and awareness.
I think that's spot on. And there's a lot in there, what you just said, and it's really valuable. So I think what I've already done is trying to come up with those key areas. There is, you've mentioned a lot of things, and I think you pretty much touched on each of these areas. This is a really good overview that BDO actually did. They interview board directors and get what are the main roles around ESG. And I think you touched upon a lot of these things about setting the ESG direction and strategy, really making sure you clear oversight and responsibility at the board level. That's something that a lot of companies are not sure at the board, like who's actually looking after ESG. Clearly making sure that from a risk and opportunity perspective, that you're not just looking at the traditional risks and opportunities, but look at those non-financial, the ESG and sustainability risks and opportunities. You touched upon data quality and effective controls in place there, that making sure that you go into reporting, that you actually have quality data that's been checked, you know how you're collecting it, you know who in the team, from an integration accountability point of view, who's actually delivering that report, how are they doing that, and how does it align then with the board's ESG strategy and direction. And then I think you touched upon as well about the communication around it. So getting the report out, making sure you talk about it regularly, but also being in a position as a board, not just the business, to actually be confident around ESG. We see a lot of companies that are doing ESG, but the board is a little bit removed from that. And if you ask a director about ESG, they're very hesitant. And I think we need to break that barrier there and get them across the board here. So I think like this is a bit of a systematic way of looking at it. And I think you touched upon a lot of them. So that's really great. And the other thing that you mentioned, I think like for FYI, it's really clear that you're there as a non-executive director. You've got definitely that mandate around ESG. You're very engaged. Like FYI is in a very good place. But a lot of boards are willing to do the work on ESG, but they're not sure who should drive the agenda. So again, from the BDO survey, what we see is that generally speaking, there is mostly the nomination and governance committee is basically looking after ESG. But if we go down there, what we see, what is really something that's gaining traction lately, and there's a big growth in there, is in having a separate ESG committee. I think FYI's got one. A lot of companies are making sure that ESG is squarely on the agenda by giving it its own committee, saying we clearly need 1, 2, or 3 people that own this and look after this piece. So I just wanted to flag that there, because it's really one of the best practices that FYI is practicing, but it's something that's clearly on the map there that is really rising there. So I wouldn't be surprised if soon we see that climb up, and at some point the majority of companies will have its own ESG committee. So I think that's really good. Now, I had a look at the at FYI's latest sustainability report for financial year 2022, and just to going back towards what you just spoke about, and that systematic view of what are the key areas and the role of the board. Like some of the highlights here, you can clearly link that directly back to some of those components. So I think it's really interesting to see that over the course of that year, pretty much every area gets a highlight here in the overview of your sustainability report. So what it shows to me is, again, that the business is on top of it. There's a systematic approach to looking at ESG. There's clear oversight and governance. So I think it's a really good way as well to communicate that, making sure that whether you do it quarterly or twice yearly or one time annually, provide your shareholders, your stakeholders at large with what are you doing, what are your highlights, and it can be just a dozen bullet points. It really clearly puts it on the map. So great work there. Now, I want to jump in then. Just to,
go ahead. I wanted to add that a lot of people, when they go into this ESG journey, they're looking at it from a compliance perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Some companies just don't have the stomach for risk. So if you're looking at risk, a lot of times you're literally looking at the transitional risk, the physical risk. That's okay. But I think later on, if you have that kind of leadership and if you can see how the trend is going, then you probably have more tolerance or even more appetite for opportunities. So every company is on a particular continuum, right? Are you looking at ESG from a risk perspective, or are you looking at ESG from an opportunity perspective? So obviously you can start with the risk first and then move your way up to a more integrated approach. So we shouldn't kid ourselves and say, okay, now that we have a chair for the ESG and therefore you have this white knight solution and therefore it's going to fix itself. I mean, even for our company, we realize that having an ESG chair and a committee is not good enough. You really have to include all the board members. So about 6% of the companies in the ASX have training on ESG, which is a real concern. We need to do more. And so apart from including people from your audit and risk or even compensation committee, I think it makes sense to have a training once a year just to keep your board updated with what's going on in the market.
At this spot on, yeah, I would say exactly the same there. Getting the board along, engaging them, and yes, the responsibility can be squarely with a committee, but everyone needs to have at least some basic one-on-one on ESG and some upskilling annually. Very, very key points there. And that really helps to bridge into the next section, is going into that reporting season, because inevitably at some point a director will be asked about ESG. And the further we go forward into the future, the more this is on the radar. So you can't really escape ESG. So I think to your point, what you just flagged is, well, do I have to report ESG? It's not compliance yet. For most companies, especially in Australia, there are a few thresholds and a certain few things you might need to do. But for mostly the micro and small caps, it's voluntary reporting. So the big question then is, who demands this ESG information? Why are you doing it in the first place? What do you see from your perspective? Who's mostly driving this need for ESG?
So it's really common sense, right? You have shareholders activism nowadays. You have customers demanding it. You have your employees asking questions. So recently, I just had a chat with a huge accounting firm. And they were saying that they were trying to get as many graduates as possible to fill some positions. And instead of interviewing these employees, they are now getting interviewed. So the younger generation that come in, they want to know, what are your stance on modern slavery? How are you helping clients? Or how are you helping clients in the area of auditing or accounting to make sure that there are no financial abuse or any kind of corruption and all sorts of things. So as we can see from the recent debacle with PwC, you can see how people are a lot more aware of these sort of things. So for the company, why you're doing it, I think it's just a matter of trying to get the best people in your company. We're already experiencing a labor shortage, and branding and communication and also reputation takes a long time to build. So if you wanted to make sure that you connect with the right people, with the right core or the right kind of values, then you need to start communicating it effectively. And a lot of times I realize that when we run this exercise with even our clients or with the board, in the beginning, it was all about which one do we focus on? How do we do this? And then the conversation became, what is really our core? So a lot of companies have been doing well for a number of years, or they've been around for a long time. So when you're successful, you don't think about your core. What is it that, what is your core sole purpose in existing in this world, other than making money and then feeding the community or your employees? So a lot of companies are starting to wonder, what is our core? I mean, we manufacture or we manufacture this car, or we mine these alumina that's going to go into these EV cars. But what is it that you stand for? So a lot of this exercise then went back to that, because without that alignment with the core business, you're not going to have a genuine communication strategy when it comes to reporting, when it comes to after you've reported, after you've achieved all its ratings, you're gonna have issues explaining why you need to do this. So I think it still goes back to your values, right? Otherwise, it's just another whitewashing experience.
That's spot on. And we see that come back in a lot of the ESG standards and frameworks as well. First question is, what is your corporate purpose? So it's not about your mission and your vision, and that's all great, but really, what do you stand for? Now, a lot of companies start there, but the main question then again is what can I report when I'm just starting? So a lot of companies want to get something out there quickly. Now, corporate purpose statement is always a good start as well. But I think the main thing is that what they say, so what's good enough? So what are my, like you just said, who's after this information? Well, your stakeholders at large. So it's your employees, it's your investors, your shareholders, your suppliers, your customers. What do they want to see? And it often drives something in companies that, it sounds like a lot of work. It's too hard. We need to be perfect before we can do something, get something out there. Now, and I think, like you already alluded to, is that what most people want to see is that you're starting and that you're doing something. So what is good enough investors generally say something is better than nothing. Give me something.
Yeah.
So if you do a materiality assessment first,
yeah,
then that's show me that. Yeah.
So basically with environment, it's easy, right? I wouldn't say it's easy, but essentially you need to be able to demonstrate what are the impact that your company or your company's operation, whether you've gone into production or not, how is it going to impact on waste management? How do you actually reduce pollution? How do you actually mitigate any kind of climate risk? And more importantly, how do you make sure that the way you operate is sustainable, right? And with these kind of operation sort of things, and even your strategy, long-term, short-term, mid-term, you have to actually be able to just illustrate that in your report. And then I think more importantly, there are various minimum standards in Australia set up by the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act in 2007. Might want to have a look. And of course, recently, we are also going to introduce the Climate Change Act in 2022. So those are just some of the minimum standards, and they should talk to Social Suite, to get some updates on that. With social, that's an interesting piece. So for the last 2 years, a lot of companies have been focusing on the EBIT, which I think is really important. But with the social bit, that's where I see a lot of gaps, right? So the social dimensions of the ESG is really just asking companies, what are your relationships? Or how are you actually monitoring the relationship with your shareholders, your employees, your executives, your vendors, and also the people that the communities that you're working with. So all the relationships that you need to declare. But more importantly, how do we actually engage people in the areas of really difficult topics like human rights, labor practices, and also how do you actually get your employees to communicate with one another effectively, whistleblowing kind of program or protection. Do you have diversity and inclusion on your board, in your company? How are your hiring practices like? Do people feel that they're being treated safely, fair? In the production side, are they safe? Are they healthy? And more importantly, have you conduct yourself in a responsible and also ethical manner? And then you have the governance. Essentially, the governance is on the systems and the processes of measuring those first two. But you have to basically look at executive compensation. You have to look at transparency. How do you actually measure accountability? More importantly, have you adhered to any kind of legal or regulatory requirements? And obviously, different states may have different requirements or jurisdictions if you're operating overseas. But more importantly, you need to describe what kind of appropriate oversight measures you have in regards to making sure that everything runs on track and that you have abide to all the legislative and common law. So those are just some of the basic things. But back to the social thing, the Modern Slavery Act was legislated in 2018. It's been 5 years now. So I know it takes a while for companies to get their head around it, but you need to make sure that not just your first tier, but second tier supply, people who provide services to you or provide the raw materials to you are going to be compliant too. There's no more excuses as in I didn't know, I don't know. And more importantly, if you have if you have a look at earlier this year, the Germans have already legislated the Supply Chain Act. So the Norwegians are taking what?
Yeah, there's a lot happening in that regulation space, so we really need to keep a close eye there. It is a lot of voluntary reporting, but there's a lot going on around things that are coming our way. Now, what I wanted to quickly bring up here is when we're talking about the reporting season, everyone is going to get their annual report together over the next few months, looking at that. That's pretty clear. But what are you doing on that ESG side of things, the sustainability side? And I think there's some really good assets here from FYI resources, sustainability reports, an ESG baseline report, and some quarterly progress reports, like what are we actually doing on a quarter-by-quarter basis? Now, there's a lot here. If we go back to the question around where do you start, I think it's really useful to start picking this apart a little bit and thinking about, well, where's the world going at large? Like ideally, and there's definitely some movement towards that, is we don't have just an annual report and a sustainability report, but we merge that together into an integrated report, which got everything in there. But for now, you're starting out on this journey, that can be hard because quite a few components there. So if we just pick apart the sustainability report for a moment and look at what could be in there, then like we flagged earlier, start looking at, out of all the sustainability topics out there, what is actually material to your industry and specifically to your business. There are hundreds of different topics, disclosure items and metrics, but if you're a technology company, you shouldn't have to worry about land use and water use on biodiversity areas. That's not relevant to you. So find the ones that are relevant, which is a good way to engage your stakeholders as well. And when you do that, you quite quickly have a set of, say, a dozen or so material topics, could be a few more, but then you can really focus to a gap analysis, which you flagged, Sandy, earlier, is that what do you already have in the business? There might be a lot of information that you already have. You already have your anti-corruption policy, your whistleblower policy. So take those things and feed that into that gap analysis. Work out where do you need to close some gaps, where can you improve, and ultimately then bring that all together in a really simple ESG baseline report like FYI Resources did. Take an ESG standard, which is structured, standardized, and incomparable. Like that's a key thing for a lot of stakeholders. They want to be able to compare you on the same metrics as your peer companies, because otherwise they can't make sense of the information. So these are some really good starting points for a company to start thinking about. If I'm just starting this journey, what are some of the things I can do? But I would like to bring it back quickly to what can you do in the reporting season as a director? So what are some of the things that might be coming your way? And I think you've flagged quite a few of them already. I think it's that having clarity and responsibility at the board level, like knowing your role, but also understanding really what is important. So what are the material issues? You shouldn't have to be able to talk about every material or about every sustainability issue, but the ones that matter to your company. And look at that gap analysis. So understand where, do we have some weaknesses or gaps, and where are we particularly strong? Have that direction and strategy in place. So really be ready to share the big picture. This is what we're going to do for the next 5 years. We've got an approach. We understand what our risks and opportunities are. So a bit of that in-depth knowledge. Show what you're doing. So ESG achievements and highlights. But any director, and again, it shouldn't just be the ESG chair or committee, but any director needs to be ready to answer questions. So engage with your stakeholders, have enough knowledge. And if you don't, make sure you do a bit of upskilling there. There's a whole range of ESG courses out there. You can go out. There's a lot of people to talk to. You can talk to me, you can talk to Sandy, and you'll learn a lot, hopefully, about ESG, enough to be more confident. What else? With the reporting season coming in here, Sandy, is there anything else you would add to that specifically for directors to think about, to be ready?
I think just be realistic about what you can achieve and plan it out between 1 year to 2 years, 3 years to 5 years. And also, I think training is a big component. I think a lot of companies, because they've been, for example, they've been in mining for 40 years, and therefore they think they know. They said, oh yeah, we know about social. Yeah, we take good care of our employees. But then you realize, they are not fully aware of what they need to do when it comes to indigenous engagement. When they are going into exploration, they're going to use a particular land. You don't know how to manage your relationship with the people who are going to give you the social license or the authority to operate. So you need to have that kind of conversation, and you cannot just make that assumption. So the problem is a lot of people made that assumption that, oh yeah, ESG, maybe just another fad or something that belongs to the CFO. He's doing the reporting. He will figure it out. From a director's perspective, you have to answer to your shareholders at AGMs. So it's not good enough to just point the finger at someone and say, let that person answer the question. And also nowadays, people follow people on social media. They go onto press and they try to figure out, as a leader or as a board member, what are your thought leadership in this space? Is it something that you have to do, or that you would really want to make a difference? So,
And we see that happening a lot. Absolutely. We see the really engaged companies we work with really being out there on social media, sharing like genuinely what they're doing around sustainability. So that's really something that people follow. They follow your company and they want to get an update, not just on how you're performing financially, but what are you doing?
Exactly. And what are your plans for the future? So we have some companies, so you can't just help companies who are in a pure play. A whole lot of companies are in the transitional space. And then you also have another set of companies who are legacy companies, who are so-called in the dirty energy space. Someone needs to help them to transition too. Now, they might want to change their storage from the gas to hydrogen, right, which is a renewable energy source. So someone needs to be able to hear that so that they can have the confidence to continue to stay with the company and continue to invest so that the company can transition successfully. But if you don't talk about it, if you don't highlight your challenges, then how is anyone going to help you? I mean, you could be sitting around your board members or your board colleagues, but if no one communicates about where your inertials are, where your biggest concern, then you won't be able to set the right strategy for long term.
Yeah, spot on. I think like we got questions in the last week from a few people asking, well, my annual report is coming up soon. Can we still do something? Now, this is just a bit of a quick visualization. There's quite a few things you can do quite quickly. If you want to still do something in time of your annual report, whether that's due by the end of August or September, like doing some work on materiality, on your gap analysis, or even looking at that first cut of a baseline report, these things can be done. It's a realistic timeline to get some work done. And again, it's not about perfection. It is about good enough. It's just something is better than nothing. So I think that's really important. And I just, by looking at the time, just want to round up here with some really simple, practical first steps. First one is, engage the board, get them all involved, look at your materiality, set your priorities, use a structured framework or standard to disclose so it's comparable, so people can really look at that and say, okay, I get what you're doing here. Make sure you're genuine. So substantiate any ESG statements. So really make sure that you don't overcommit and you can't deliver on it. Demonstrate if you're claiming something, you're actually doing it. Back it up with data and do that frequently. So provide frequent ESG updates to really own your narrative and your data there, and make sure it's easy to access. So we see more and more companies not hiding sustainability somewhere down in the investor center, but at the front page, the homepage, the top menu, there's sustainability or ESG. You can easily find the material that you're after as a stakeholder. And then really for a lot of companies as well, it's really important to make sure in investor decks, you might have 10 or 12 slides in there, but make sure one says something about ESG. Even if you bring it up for 10 seconds, we find a lot of the 100 companies we work with at the moment say that has been invaluable to just stick it in there. Someone sees it in your presentation, even if it's for a few seconds, it comes to you afterwards, says, you're serious about ESG, tell me more about it. It drives the narrative, it demonstrates you're doing something in the space, and it really makes sure that you're being considered by people that are really finding ESG important. So with that, I want to just quickly jump back to Brad and see if there were any questions from the audience. I think that we've reached the half-hour mark, but there might be one or two questions that have come in that are worth looking at. So, Brad, is there anything else that the audience has shared with you that you can answer?
Sandy and Tim, firstly, well done on covering such a broad topic in such a short amount of time. No doubt that everybody that's on the call at the moment has found that invaluable. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to ask those questions in the chat section. But one point that I'd just like to touch on is that, Sandy, you mentioned before about using these reports at the AGM being a really important part. So obviously going through the reporting season, getting all this information together, disclosing it onto the ASX, your website and so on. And then all of a sudden you're sitting there at the AGM and somebody gets asked a question around that. So it'd be great to understand from your perspective, how do you align boards and get the board thinking in a pretty consistent way so you go in with a united front at the AGM?
Okay, so technically, how we do it is right from the first quarter of the year, the board, not just the ESG committee, the board will have a conversation about what are our plans, what are our targets. And then we take this on a more granular level at the ESG committee. And all that is done in the first quarter of the year. Then the second quarter of the year, we start to collect data. We start to analyze some of these information that we have, based on last year's review, but more importantly, we also go through some level of training with our board. And then quarter three, that's where we do the submission. That's where we actually have, some feedback that we got from Social Suite, and also we got some feedback later on, the third quarter, near the end of the third quarter of the year, from the ratings organization like Sustainalytics. And that's where we can really reflect on how we can improve it, what are some of the feedback we can adopt. And then Q4, that's where we do the AGM. And then during the AGM, we have to basically, address these questions of our shareholders, but more importantly, what sort of targets we're going to do it. So it's first you prepare and you try to plan. Secondly, then you try to collect the data. In the third quarter, you review and you start preparing for submission. And then the final quarters, that's where you start to reflect on how you can improve on them. But essentially, yeah, at the AGM, even before the AGM, I would really suggest companies to do a survey of all their major shareholders and basically get their sentiments. If you've been doing ESG for the first 2 years already, or even the 4th year, it's always a good idea to still find out whether you're on track or whether this is the concerns they have, because it comes in trends and also it comes in cycles, right? 1 year, COP26 was huge. Everyone wants to talk about environment. And then another year, people are talking about, indigenous rights or reconciliation action plan or labor rights. So you need to make sure that you're on track. Obviously, you're not doing this just for the sake of window dressing, but I think it is important to, find the pulse of your stakeholders and what really concerns them, and making sure that you cover all those when you're doing your reporting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandy. And it's a very prudent approach about aligning the board there. Now, we've got a few questions in. We've probably got time for a couple. We've got a question there from Peter. What are your suggestions for small cap explorers who do not have committees because of their size? And Sandy, it might be worth just exploring, just sharing the size of FYI resources at the same time.
Yeah, so we have a market cap of 140 mil. We're not huge either. And in the beginning, when I was on the board, before we set up the ESG committee 6 months later, I was at every board meetings and I make sure that there is an item in the agenda that talks about ESG. So it's not an afterthought, but it's just a matter of, soft launching that idea to make sure that all board members are fully aware of the decisions that we're making, be it a joint venture, a collaboration, or is it going to a new market or exploring a new product? So all that is on the top of mind. And then 6 months later, if you like, you can just appoint someone new, or just appoint someone who is already having that interest within your board to chair a committee. And obviously for a small company like ours, essentially when you have your ESG committee, nearly everyone is included. So it's more or less the same group of people. And I would say stick with the facts, don't be too overly ambitious, and be genuine. Again, link it back to your values. People need to be able to see that consistency and alignment. If not, they're just going to see you as a fraud. Yeah, people are very, nowadays, shareholders and customers are very smart. They know how to ask all these questions. So you better have the answers for it. Yeah.
Just conscious of time, maybe we'll just take one more question and then we'll follow up individually with people that have asked questions. I know that there's a lot of interest, and I suppose the last question to answer in today's session is from Michael, which is in relation to like what is in terms of voluntary reporting and legislative reporting, and why are companies reporting? Why are companies actually reporting around that? So what are the requirements? Or is it really a voluntary thing that organizations are doing? So I'll open that up.
So currently it's voluntary. And any technical details, I would really suggest you talk to Social Suite about it. They have much better grasp for the timeline and some of this legislation. But from what we understand is the PRI is trying to not lobby the government, but basically put together some papers already and say, you know what, ASX 300, anything above 100 mil to 4 bill, you have to do it mandatorily. So it's just coming. So you just have to make sure that you're on the right side. With voluntary, if you want to start, just go with some of the standards that are just really widely known. I think the most popular one is the GRI. And if you really want to take that one step further, you can also have a look at, becoming a member of the UN Global Compact in Australia. So they basically said, okay, we follow these principles, these 10 principles that will not abuse on human rights or labor rights. But on top of that, they also adopt the SDG goals. So as the founding chair for the SDG Forum here in WA, I'm very passionate about advocating and promoting the SDGs. I don't think this is something that only big corporation can own. If you have a look at all those targets, I'm sure everyone can say, yeah, I'm for gender equality, or I'm for quality education. This is not just for large corporations or developing countries. Everyone can own that. So have a look at those targets and see, what you have already done, and basically use that as a guideline. And the rest, you can basically just depend on professionals and experts like the Social Suite to guide you along.
Wonderful. Well, Tim, Sandy, thank you for spending the time over the last 30 minutes or a little over 30 minutes to discuss this. There's no doubt it could have been a 2-day session and we'd still not have enough time to discuss what we've already spoken about. There is a number of questions that are unanswered. So what we'll follow up individually with people to answer those questions. So certainly appreciate your participation for the wider people joining today on the session. And once again, thanks to Tim and Sandy for your contribution today. If anyone would like further information, please get in touch with us at Social Suite. More than happy to step through and show you how we're approaching that with other organisations. Some contact details there, and we'll follow up separately via email as well. So thanks again. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. So Tim, I'll be very curious about all these other unanswered questions as well. So feel free to send them my way too. I just want to review them.